Good morning, everybody. I'm Emma and I'm on the marketing team here at SafePaaS, and I just wanted to welcome you today to our panel discussion, which is part of a series of events we're doing entitled Oracle Governance, Risk and Compliance, Dead Product or Brave New World, which basically covers everything you need to know now that Oracle GRC is on very limited support. So we've created a content-rich set of webinars to help you understand what you need to consider moving forward. So as part of the launch session for that event, we've invited a very special group of panelists with us today who witnessed the beginnings of GRC. They were around when the first GRC products were brought to market for Oracle, have huge insight into the space and where it should be heading. So please join me in welcoming Nigel King, Brian O'Neill, Yanni Wetzel, and Adil Khan. If you'd like to briefly introduce yourselves, and then we can dive into the discussion.
Great, thank you, Emma. I think reading from left to right, that probably puts me up first. So thank you very much for the introduction. My name's Nigel King. So my seat at the table, I suppose, was earned from the fact that I was happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right bees in my bonnet when the whole GRC thing happened at Oracle. So was very fortunate to be there and bring that what turned into a whole product category to market at the time. So I'm an Oracle vet for about 22 years. Moved from there to be Chief Architect and Chief Information Security Officer for an educational technology company. Based out of Sacramento Power School, back in the UK these days, running. I'm actually the CEO of Software Strategy Tools and Consulting, and also lecturing at Nottingham Trent University in information technology.
So I guess that puts me up next. So I'm Brian O'Neill. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Appsurance, and we're based in Tampa, Florida. I've actually been in the space now almost 25 years, and we'll talk more about my career as we get into the webinar, because my career essentially mirrors that of the ERP and also the more importantly the GRC space. But in brief, I started my career as a consultant at Oracle. From Oracle, I went to Ernst & Young, and almost 17 years ago, I started Appsurance, where we focus on ERP security controls and implement continuous controls monitoring software such as SafePaaS.
I guess that puts me next. Thanks, Brian, and look forward to this discussion. Yanni Wetzel. Well, I think we probably all started more or less at maybe a year or two close to each other in this space. Started in the late 90s with risk and controls, then that became GRC for the ERPs, and then I also continue my discussions with the GRCs in the Archers, Metric Stream, BWise, and all the others going on. So many years really saw the migration from risk and controls to enterprise risk management and the different risk management initiatives in the different areas. So look forward to the discussion.
Thanks,
Thank
Yanni.
you, gentlemen. Yeah, I really want to thank, first of all, everybody that joined today's session, and especially this panelists that I've had the pleasure and opportunity to work for decades now. We're going to try to boil down 2 decades of our relationships and customer experiences down to a 45 or 50-minute session here. It's a lot to cover. I won't be too long in my introductions. My background, like many of my colleagues here, is from finance, audit, and technology. I worked at Oracle in a Big 4 audit firm and ended up starting a company here in Dallas that ended up going public through an IPO process, and had the opportunity to run that public company when Sarbanes-Oxley showed up. So as someone responsible for financial controls, having to sign SOX reports 302 and 404, as Bush had signed Sarbanes-Oxley into the law back in 2002, I thought it'd be an opportunity for many companies to learn from our lessons, and went to Oracle, met Nigel, and the rest is history, as they say. So Nigel and I have written a book on this topic as well, if you're interested. It covers some of the, the areas of governance, risk, and compliance, beyond just the products, right? So today we're going to talk a little bit about the product, but I think this panels are really helpful to talk about, the bigger governance, risk, and compliance needs, which have been here, as my colleagues have said, for 25 plus years. So we're excited to have you all, and let's jump right in, Emma.
Yes, thanks for that, Adil. Before we do start, I would like to say there will be a Q&A session at the end. So if you do have any questions, then just pop them into the control panel and send those across, and we'll try and get to those at the end of the session. So we'll be following the following agenda today. We'll be starting off with the beginnings of GRC, where it all started, the origins, the evolution of GRC, and finishing up with GRC in the future. So let's dive right into the discussion. As you all know, GRC has been around for 20 odd years or so, and basically first started as a framework to comply with SOX. So Brian, let's start with you. We'd like to hear your insight on the topic. So how did it all start?
Well, thanks. So first, let me thank to you, Emma, and Adil for the opportunity to present on this webinar, because it's a privilege to present with Nigel and Yanni, because as we've all mentioned, we've essentially grown up, if you will, in this space. So I think together I would have to imagine we have over 100 years of experience. So hopefully that'll benefit those listening on this webinar. So thank you for the opportunity. Well, before I get into the GRC space, I think we have to look at the broader ERP space, because when you look at it, the ERP space itself is really started in the early 90s. So ERP is really less than 30 years old itself. Before ERP, it was more MRP, MRP2, which is, material resource planning. And that, essentially morphed into what we know as ERP now, where it was kind of the integration of the financial applications, supply chain, manufacturing, HR, payroll, et cetera. And, from that then, as we'll talk about in a minute, really came the what we now know as GRC, or continuous controls monitoring, enterprise risk management. It goes by different names. But it really, this, as I mentioned earlier, the ERP and GRC space really mirrors that of my professional career. And I think we have to break it down, Emma, into essentially different eras, if you will. Let's first look at the late 90s. As ERP was coming more and more widely accepted. The vendors such as Oracle and SAP, JD Edwards, Bond, Lawson to a lesser extent, were really coming into the vernacular of organizations, and were really changing the way organizations operated. They went, from the green screen mainframe systems, such as BPIX and MAPIX, to these now, client server, to completely different technologies. So, as I mentioned, it mirrored my career. I started with Oracle back in 1996. Oracle had acquired a company out of the Boston area called IRI Software. IRI Software brought to Oracle, and essentially, and Nigel might eventually correct me on this, but I believe IRI Software was actually Oracle's first acquisition in the history of the company. Up to that point, Oracle had developed everything internally, and had shied away from acquisition. So they acquired IRI. What you'll know, or many of you who've been in this, the ERP space for a number of years, IRI brought to Oracle applications such as Financial Analyzer, Sales Analyzer, and some of the early analytical products. So back in the day in Oracle, I wore many hats. I was the person demoing the Financial Analyzer. I was then selling Financial Analyzer. A month later, I was implementing Financial Analyzer. That morphed into me implementing General Ledger, fixed assets, accounts payable. But one thing to note: this wasn't GUI. Back in 1996, these were green screen applications. So completely different technologies. So as I mentioned, we go back 30 years. ERP as we know it today was still green screen, including Oracle. Many don't know that Oracle was actually started as a green screen, if you will, application. So stayed with Oracle for a year, and in February of '97, get a call from a headhunter and told me that Ernst & Young was hiring for a yet-to-be-named group that was going to focus on ERP, specifically Oracle, security and controls. So I took a shot and I joined Ernst & Young in 1997. This was March of '97. And again, as I mentioned, companies were just beginning to implement the likes of Oracle and SAP, PeopleSoft, JD Edwards, and Bond. And E&Y realized that they didn't have the knowledge in-house to effectively audit these types of applications. So this group was eventually called Application Controls Consulting. Our focus, our charter, was essentially to help organizations or help the audit, the core audit teams assess application security and application controls, and also assist clients with the design of application security and the design of controls. So in August of '97, E&Y actually had their very first training, Application Controls Consulting, in Cleveland. Now you may be wondering, how do I remember that this training was in August '97? Because I had to leave the training on a Thursday because I was getting married on that Friday. And I've been married now 23 years, so that's how I remember when and how long. But that just shows you that the birth of this practice, even with Ernst & Young, was didn't happen until August of '97 when we did our very first training. And when it started, it was a partner, a senior manager, and a senior consultant out of Minneapolis, and a consultant out west, a guy by the name of Brian Hickey, who's now CFO of a company in Phoenix. So I went on my honeymoon, came back, and we started a project. Actually, was on a project with one of SafePaaS's resources, Bob Enders. We did an implementation at a company called Vita Marine in Fort Lauderdale. Started the implementation on 10.6 character, and eventually moved on to the 10.7 Smart Client, or 10.7 SC, which is the first GUI version of Oracle. And I thought I was on that project to do security controls work, but again, at that point, if you could spell Oracle, you were essentially thought you can implement Oracle. So in addition to implementing, or designing and assessing controls and security, I was brought on to co-lead the implementation of General Ledger and accounts payable for Vita Marine, which is now Seabolt Marine. So, something to note as well, and again, dating myself back in 97 and 98, is what we think of Oracle support. Oracle, or support.oracle.com, didn't exist back then. Oracle support consisted of three things. It was a user guide for each module and a technical implementation guide. And if you needed to talk to somebody, there was a 1-800 number that you called. There was nothing online. And the 1-800 number might sound good, but we would oftentimes wait 2, 3, 4 hours on hold just to get a live person. And then, 9 out of 10 times the person that answered the call wasn't able to answer the question. So the term RTFM came into the vernacular of consulting, of consultants. I will let everybody on this call figure out for themselves what RTFM means, but I can assure you it started in the late 90s on ERP implementations. So that, that was kind of the birth, quote unquote, of the kind of the ERP, the large scale implementations. But really what kind of supercharged that whole initiative of implementing ERP was really Y2K. So that's kind of the next event that happened, because these ERP implementations were, typical, large scale global implementations that really transformed the way these organizations operated. They were, accustomed to having these standalone financial applications and standalone purchasing applications, standalone inventory applications. Well, with an Oracle and SAP or JD Edwards or a Bond, now it's all integrated. So all their application security was brand new. All their application controls were brand new. Auditors simply didn't know what to do or how to audit those types of applications. So for all intents and purposes, that was really the first time that the IT audit practices of these big firms, big 4 audit firms, or big 5, I guess back then, it might have been big 8 back then, really started to engage with their IT audit staffs, because they were now asked to, do these audits of these organizations that had fundamentally transformed the way they did their back office operations. So, they would give us, 40 hours to do work, which we knew required, 100, 120 hours, but at least it was something to at least assist them with the audit. And taking you back then, well, how did we audit these ERP applications? Because again, software didn't yet exist. It's still late 90s. This is, 97, 98, 99, and into early 2000. Well, segregation of duties was done via spreadsheet. We would create these big spreadsheets that had, the modules listed down the left. And so for General Ledger, then we would have the different functions listed. We would have enter journal entry, post journal entry, open and close GL, for accounts payable, invoicing, payments, etc. and then the names of their responsibilities across the top. And we just put X's in the boxes that kind of identified what functionality those responsibilities were supposed to have. Well, as you can imagine, the challenge with that is when I would come in with my audit hat on, I would ask, well, how are you ensuring that all of the different functions that you are available to, say, enter a journal entry have been covered? And I would get the deer in the headlights. They were oftentimes not aware that they were, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different functions and programs within Oracle to actually do a journal entry or post a journal entry or do a purchase order. So it was flawed from the beginning, but it was something, in the absence of something other than Excel. And then from a configuration perspective to handle like the program change control with these ERPs, it was essentially the same thing. We would come in, identify the quote unquote, significant configurations. We would document what the company had set them to. But again, the challenge was, if you look at program change control, although when we were at that very moment, they had it set to had matching set to 3-way, there was no way to know if the moment we walked out the door, if they were then coming back and changing it after we left to a different type of setting. And so that was prevalent. And again, asked how they, managed that, they didn't oftentimes have a very good answer of how they were actually managing that internally. So it was a challenge. So that kind of leads us, I'll take it into the third era, and this is kind of where the software kind of comes into play. And that's Sarbanes-Oxley, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. That essentially threw gasoline on the fire. And this is now where if the auditors thought they were being challenged with audits up to this point, Sarbanes-Oxley, put it on overdrive. And the need for software was evident because there were rising audit budgets. Companies started to push back on that. So the auditors and the organizations that were being audited needed software in order to do the tasks that up to this point had been done 100% manually. And to that point, as I mentioned earlier, pre-SOX, these IT audit staff, me being a part of the E&Y IT audit staff, where we used to fight to get 40 hours. Now suddenly the core audit teams, suddenly I found that they could give us 200 hours, 300 hours, 400 hours, but that was really, 100% due to Sarbanes-Oxley. And I think it legitimized also the IT audit staffs within these firms because we were heavily relied upon for performing these types of tasks and assisting them with their external audit and with their Sarbanes audits. Right. So then software I mentioned, came into play at this point. And from an Oracle perspective, there were really 3 vendors. As Dill mentioned and as Nigel mentioned, Nigel, for all intents and purposes, is the founder, if you will, the godfather of GRC software, what is now known as or continuous controls monitoring software, because Nigel and his team at Oracle developed and brought to market the very first product. But what was nice about the ICM product, Internal Controls Manager, is it wasn't just a segregation of duties tool. It included segregation of duties functionality. It included application configuration, monitoring, reporting. And because of SOX, it introduced compliance management functionality to where you could document your risk, document your controls, test those controls, report on or document issues in the testing, and then generate reports that could then be used by to report up to management and ultimately to the board. But before all of this, the SOD, the request for SOD solution was, I need an SOD solution now, or my auditors are going to give me significant deficiency. So that was basically what it was referred to. I'm going to come back to Nigel in a bit because he was very prophetic in something he mentioned to me the first time I met him. But moving on to other software, so there were 2 other vendors in the space. One was Tickmark Solutions, which eventually changed the name to Applimation. Yeah, Tickmark was based in the Garment District of New York City, started by a guy named Mark Nelson. And their application at Tickmark, there were essentially 2 products. There was Integra Access, which is covered, and it was for segregation of duties. And their flagship product was actually a product called Integra Apps, which today, for all intents and purposes, is the Oracle Configuration Controls product. If you look at the way, those that are familiar with the Oracle CCG product, it's essentially the legacy Integra Apps product. And so, once Sarbanes-Oxley hit, I would travel to New York City essentially every month for 2 or 3 days, and I would spend part of my days with Jennifer DeLorenzo. She was on the Integra Access, so I would be feeding her requirements that I was getting from my clients, and then she would take those requirements and can build those out in an Integra Access. And then on other days, I would sit with a gentleman by the name of Barry Greenhut, and he was the product owner for the Integra apps. Some of you may still know the name Barry Greenhut because he's still in product management, product ownership of the risk management cloud product Oracle, previously the GRC products. So Barry is actually still actively engaged in the space at Oracle, but that's more of a side note. So, but my point is their products are being built as I was feeding them, and others were feeding them requirements for their Integra Access and Integra Apps products. And then I was the beta tester for that functionality. And then the third vendor in the space for the Oracle space at the time was Logical Apps. But interesting about Logical Apps, they were out of Irvine, California, started by Chris Captabella and Paul Brunskow. Paul and Chris were actually Oracle consultants doing implementations. And in their implementations, they struggled to find a tool that would help them customize the EBS or the Oracle applications efficiently, effectively, and save them a lot of time and effort. It simply didn't exist, that type of technology. So they actually created a product, formed a company called Logical Apps, and brought to market that product. Well, then along comes Sarbanes-Oxley, and suddenly Logical Apps is a SOX vendor. And their products, many of you know, their product now is called Preventive Controls Governor, was called Preventive Controls Governor, which up until recently was still supported by Oracle. But that is, PCG is the legacy Logical Apps product. Logical Apps was ultimately acquired, a part of Applimation, and then Oracle acquired Logical Apps. I want to say, Nigel, you're a deal grab, I think it was like 97 that Oracle acquired Logical Apps, right around like late 97, early 98. Right.
It's a little bit later than that. I think it was 2000 something 8.
2007, 2000, yeah, something like So it was right around there. But the point is that we're talking only 11, 12 years ago. So that, again, just how really relatively new this whole space is. These acquisitions were really happening in like the 2008, 2009, 2010. And lastly, then along comes a company called Fulcrum Way, now known as SafePaaS, Adil's company. But they were then came along. Adil, you started Logical Apps, and what year did you actually go off on your own?
We started after I sold my company, and I stayed on for about a year at the public company. We started this in 2003, towards the end of 2003, and I think ICM was just coming out. Oracle had just announced it. The timing just clicked for us.
I think you were at the using workflow for process controls session that I did.
So I knew Chris Captabella, and I knew the Tick to Mark guys, and then I could see that was going to be important at some point. But most of our customers, to Brian's point, were still at the stage of documenting their process narratives and doing flowchart using Oracle Tutor. Was it Tutor? Yeah. And
Oracle Tutor. Yeah.
We wanted to bring in all this great technology that we were aware of, like you're talking about, but the customers were saying, "Hang on, we're going to get 12 people in." I remember Reader's Digest, which was one of our joint accounts with ICM and Logical Apps. They said, no, we're just going to spend 6 months with 12 people documenting what we do first before you even get in the door. So, we had really interesting beginnings, and ICM was the way you could do that, as Brian just said. And I'd love to hear, the perspectives from Yanni and Nigel, of course.
Yeah, which I'm gonna come back to Nigel in a second, but really quick for PeopleSoft, they had a product called Internal Controls Enforcer. Obviously, with the acquisition, that became part of Oracle. SAP had, for them, they had Versa Systems, they had Approva. Approva was actually, if I recall correctly, the first kind of cross-platform. They built initially for SAP, and then ultimately for Oracle. And then kind of parallel with this, even the audit firms, the PwCs, the E&Ys, they were actually creating their own tools, which, to be perfectly honest, were not very good whatsoever, despite what the firms, either thought then or think now. They just weren't very good. And then, then there was another set of vendors introduced by Sarbanes-Oxley, and just, companies such as OpenPages and Paisley and Stellent, E100 Group, Certus, BWise. they were kind of brought to the public consciousness, and because of Sarbanes and the need for companies to document risk and controls, etc. But that was kind of a slightly different group of vendors compared to the ICMs and ICEs and Fulcrum Way and those types of vendors. And we'll come to that in a second with Yanni. But I mentioned earlier that I was going to come back to Nigel because he mentioned something very prophetic to me many years ago. When I asked him where he saw this space going, and this was again early 2000s, he gave me 2 points. He said, one, he said from what I'm seeing with our prospects at Oracle and with our ICM customers is they don't either one have the expertise to manage these applications internally, or the second issue these companies are having is they don't know where to put the ownership of internal controls managers. So my advice to you is to kind of fill that void and kind of work with companies to kind of allow them to co-source or outsource the operation of ICM on their behalf, because they don't have the time, they don't have the resource, or they simply don't know where to put it. The other thing which I think is fascinating, and I would love to get your perspective, Nigel, on kind of where this came from. But the other thing Nigel said is he said ultimately I think companies are going to I'm trying to think how you put it, essentially it's going to be a service where you would be able to remotely analyze an organization's segregation of duties, where they are not going to have to buy the software and have it on their own internal systems. You would be able to do that assessment remotely, not only for applications, SOD, but also for configuration. So Nigel, I would ask you, given that, that was 20 years ago, why did you think that? And then at the end of this, if you can give me tonight's lottery numbers, I'd love to know them.
Well, it seems that there is. It seems that there is the user-generated content, or at least the user verification of what risks are materializing and what controls are effective, from a community perspective, seems to produce a great deal of value for everyone that participates in that community. So it seemed that it was one of those areas where if we could get people to cooperate and feel okay to let others know what risks they were facing and whether or not those controls were effective, that just the person that provided that platform could create a great deal of value for members that participated in that platform. It seemed an obvious thing to me at the time.
It was quite visionary.
Was that a further hand up? So just to speak to how we got to meet and how that whole bringing the brain trust together across all of these different organizations. I mean, I was very fortunate being in an enterprise company at the time, but I had been part of a couple of companies that had very nearly failed, and it's very interesting seeing the pattern of what happens when they were kind of very nearly failing. The finance director would be changed, and suddenly we'd have a very bad quarter, so that the new guy can blame everything on the guy that just left, but suddenly your reserves are now quite fat, and you can get through the next few quarters because you have kind of made sure that you've established some reserves, and that lasts for a few quarters. Then you have a bad quarter, and because you haven't actually changed the business very much, but you have used your ability to control financials to be able to munge the results, and now you have a bad result and the process repeats. So it became very obvious to me as an accountant that they were going to have to change auditors very frequently, much more frequently than they were doing at the moment, and that meant that we were going to have to automate the audit process. And so when Enron happened and the Enron collapse happened, I was tugging on the right people's shirts within Oracle, saying we need to look at the internal audit space, because I think the audit space is going to become very big because of what happened to Enron. And so I had been making the right sort of noises. And when Sarbanes-Oxley did hit, I think, as Brian pointed out, no one knew what to do, and so the CEOs and CFOs of very large companies were on the phone to the senior managers managers at Oracle as their technology provider. I mean, we were actually very humbled that they would consider their technology provider would have something to say in this area. And when the phone started ringing, I had made enough of a pest of myself at Oracle that they actually called me. Didn't you mention something about audit automation? And so that was kind of the birth of Internal Controls Manager. And to begin with, we were sort of trying to make sure that we understood the functionality while we were working with our own internal audit people, and sort of bringing the tools that we had to bear at the service of this problem. You know, the whole audit process is very centered around the process and the controls that are within it. So, you know, we have a process tool in Oracle Workflow. We have this documentation tool in Oracle Tutor. We sort of build the bridge between these. But we knew that there were pieces that just weren't there within the Oracle footprint. We had no repository of risks and controls. So that became like the core pieces of what the first generation of these onboard governance, risk and control applications were. And we're very good at like building those repositories, but you know, clearly we didn't have the internal expertise really to populate it with, you know, the appropriate set of risks and the appropriate set of controls and the appropriate set of tests. And that's what Brian and Yanni were out there doing in the world. So we really needed them to come in and sort of help us populate it. But the business that the audit firms were in, they had control of the content, and the business that we were in, we were building the repository. We need to find some way that we could build the bridge between those two. There were certainly some pieces of this overall puzzle that you could do without technology. I think Brian had mentioned that some of it was being done in spreadsheets in those early days, and some of it was being done in just like generating procedures manuals. But there were some pieces that you just could not do without some technology. So segregation of duties testing, I mean, that's an impossible task unless you've got some way to sweep through who's access to what and start to raise where you might have risks, where there might be collusion problems. So you know, there were some tools that we could definitely bring to the table, but you still needed this vast core of expertise that was really in the controls and security practices of the audit firms. We certainly got through a few releases. We built out quite a significant footprint. But as you move through 2003, 2004, if people are sort of remembering what was happening in the application space at the time, everybody started to acquire everybody else. So there was Oracle was acquiring PeopleSoft, and PeopleSoft had acquired JD Edwards. Like we'd acquired Stellent had E100. Suddenly, even within Oracle, we had quite a number of tools that were not our homegrown tools, and we had to kind of assemble and find successor solutions to that first generation. And about the same time, we had SAP, you know, making a great splash with our acquisition of Versa. And I think our clear-eyed view of having like one product and its features had become a bit blurred in the acquisitions that we had, and suddenly there was a very clear signal in the marketplace with SAP acquiring Versa, and that was loud and needed to be responded to, and that led to some very targeted acquisitions from Oracle for things like logical apps to make sure that we were also making noise in that same area, and that, you know, that was certainly part of that evolution and how that became like more part of the enterprise. I don't want to claim all the airtime here, so I'm gonna hand this back to Emma at this point to pose the next question.
Yes, okay, so I think we've touched on the question on the screen, so we'll move on to the next question, which talks about the acquisitions again, you know, when they did get acquired by big tech. In some people's minds, that was the downfall of GRC. Adil, thoughts on that statement?
Yeah, I think what Brian has covered the journey of 20 years eloquently in the last 15 or so minutes. And then just as Nigel was just finishing his thought about this acquisition frenzy that the software industry entered into post 2000s after the crash of the dot-com bubble. We saw, and of course combined with the Sarbanes-Oxley demand in the market for automated controls, we saw some really interesting companies come to the market that were started by great visionaries and entrepreneurs. They were funded by capital that had to exit, and so we saw, in my mind, the downfall of GRC is really these companies were just starting out, right? They were just starting to execute on this vision of GRC, which was going to eliminate the silos of risk, compliance, and governance in organizations that had been established for many decades into some kind of a unified platform. And so we saw the acquisitions that Nigel just mentioned, like the Versa was the big one with SAP, and Oracle rolled up logical apps through Applimation, which was also Tickmark. So you're seeing these roll-ups both on the ERP side as well as on the GRC side. And Open Pages was one of the early platforms that competed with ICM from an IBM. IBM acquired those organizations. I definitely want to hear from add Yanni to the discussion around his perspective, because Yanni was looking at many other platforms from a GRC management perspective in those days when we were talking. So there was Metric Stream, there was Archer, and a bunch of other key players that came to the market. But in my mind, these visionaries were just starting to execute their business model to provide that unified, proactive platform that consists of automated advanced controls, which were not really the job of ERP. ERP enabled you to, for example, put together a three-way match, but to monitor that three-way match is active, you needed ICM, you needed logical apps, you needed Applimation. So those kinds of things were just starting to build. As these companies got acquired, we saw that value proposition that we've been marketing to the customer base sort of fizzle away, right? For various reasons, generally it's true that when you go through an acquisition, it's an organization change, going from a startup to working for one of the largest software companies in the world like Oracle. It does take a change. So we saw difference in priorities, the silos within these own development shops, and so forth. So we saw, from an implementation perspective, someone that was helping customers implement, we saw kind of, I wouldn't say a complete halt, but a significant reduction in that pace of change that was happening. So in the example, since I worked a lot closer with Oracle GRC, we were expecting that Oracle, after the acquisition of logical apps, would provide us the ability to take those great workflows that worked on the forms, also work on the new ERP technology that Oracle was implementing with web services. But that never happened. So we would have complaints from our customers that, hey, we really like that idea of being able to embed controls in the process, make that process proactive, as Oracle's been preaching. But when it came down to actually executing that, only 30 or 40% of their controls could be automated because it only supported the old trigger-based, form-based technology. Same thing with Tickmark and Applimation. We saw customers that really wanted to track changes to suppliers and customers and so forth, and there were restrictions. They couldn't get the reports in the format as we were talking earlier. I think Brian mentioned he's been working with Tickmark in the late 90s, and that technology has still not changed to date, right? So some of the capabilities and the advances that have come through the technology framework didn't get incorporated after these big tech acquisitions, and so there was a little bit of drop in demand for GRC based on the lack of commitments from the big tech that had acquired GRC products, for not being able to keep up with some of the vision of these great entrepreneurs that had come to the market to help solve this problem. So as a result, what you see today is many of those older products that came to market last 20 years ago, they do the basics, but they don't deliver on the full value proposition. And so, so I think that's kind of where we're headed towards. And we stepped in as SafePaaS, rebranded us from Fulcrum Way to continue that vision of these great, visionaries that had come to market to solve the problem. And we hope, one day we'll be able to really address that value proposition and that we all committed to 20 years ago. So I'd love to hear from Yanni a little bit about your experience, because you had a much broader view of the GRC landscape than I did, and I mean maybe all of us did, because sitting in the big four organizations, you had witness to all the top players, and so I'd love to hear your perspective of where GRC is going and where it's headed. We have some further questions, but just kind of your background, where you came to GRC, and what's the landscape looks like to you.
Thanks, Adil. And I think what Brian described on how the ERP started, we saw that same story happening on the IT side, on business continuity management, threat and vulnerability management. All of these suddenly, with the embarkation of SOX and compliance requirements, organizations needed the platform to do that, hence the start of Archer, RSAM, BWise, all those tools. And they quickly started to adopt the vision, Adil, and I think that really speaks to that value proposition of one integrated platform that all of us started buying in, hence the acquisitions from the bigger players to really start driving that. That, unfortunately, every time the acquisition happened, we saw the loss of focus and really focusing on integrating that software into the Oracle world or into the SAP world, or even when you saw the acquisitions from Archer and some of the others. And at the same time, you saw a digital transformation starting to embark in organizations, move from the on-premise to the cloud-based, SaaS-based solutions. And suddenly that became important to keep up with that. And then the integrated platform kind of lost track, but that's really the demand of organizations. And on top of that, it's not a single ERP environment. It's now multiple solutions, or have always been multiple solutions. Clients just never could integrate those areas. So what we then saw is really starting to provide platforms that can document policies and procedures, and now suddenly moving from just SOX to some of the big banks now have 27,000 compliance obligations that they need to work with. And they need a tool to handle that as well. But what then we saw in the GRC market, we had the tools that handle the segregation of duties, automated controls, and monitor the changes, managing that, and then the tools that focus a lot on the IT policies, procedures, and the risk and control libraries. But that merging of the two technologies still hasn't happened as well as it could and should. And literally the past probably 24 months, we're starting to see that ability to be able to connect those tools becomes more realistic because of how technology advanced and how things changed in the world. But I think that's really where we're going to see the next couple of years happening as rapidly, is the integration of all those two technologies. If we look at the SafePaaS history and some of the other histories, is now we can do cross-platform segregation of duties. Brian, I'm sure you can remember in the early 2000s, we all talk about cross-platform segregation of duties, and there was just no tool that really could do that. Now we can, but take that, now do the integration to my identity and access management solutions like a SailPoint and Okta and some of those, integrate that, bring that into my risk and control library. Now I actually can start looking at a holistic view of risk and controls. So fast forward really to today is where we can see that integration, and I think that is where a lot of organizations are going to focus on in the next couple of years, with digital transformation, with everything in the cloud, with having multiple solutions talking to each other. The challenge for the GRC vendors or the integrated risk management vendors is really to bring that, and then add COVID on top of that, where we now realize we're not operating in a silo of a single organization, but operating as organizations across multiple platforms and multiple organizations. We need to bring that together. and maybe even start looking at segregation of duties through a supply chain that's 4 or 5 deep with multiple organizations, that we can still maintain the integrity of my information. Adil, I don't know if you want to comment further on that.
Oh, that's fantastic. I think you sort of covered this other question we have, where it's heading. I'd love to hear, from Brian and Nigel, based on, it's one thing to talk about the legacy of GRC, it's another to kind of look at the next, the next decade as we start 2020. I think, Yanni, you have pointed out some great opportunities and challenges that we should be considering as SafePaaS and as well as our customers and partners. So, maybe I'll ask Nigel, as the tech guy that's built products. Nigel, where do you see the latest technologies that are on the horizon, like AI, machine learning, robotics? Can they help bring back that value proposition that we've been talking about for 20 years and still haven't quite delivered yet?
I mean, clearly in the sort of fraud detection, anomaly detection area, it's almost like it is a textbook example. What we've been doing in the sort of transaction monitoring space is that we are the experts in an expert system. We kind of know what patterns we're looking for. We codify those patterns so that we can surface when those patterns arise. That seems a very 1970s way to approach the audit problem, and certainly the rise in the popularity and the amount of the public mindset that AI and machine learning have, it's going to be moving into that audit space. To be able to discover patterns that as an auditor that might not be obvious to you, like to make sure that we can actually find anomalies and kind of work out what those anomalies are showing us, is really what the promise of AI is. Although my own belief is that it'll never be a truly unsupervised system, that we will always be sort of supervising it, because we want to make sure that, even though we are reporting some anomalies and we're reporting some exceptions, that we can go back in and just check that there's nothing in the overall body of transactions that should be reported that is not, that a human eye would see as anomalous, that maybe the machine is not attuned to yet. So I think that we're going to still have experts like, I'm sure that Yanni is going to have a long and fruitful career out there being the expert in the field for many years to come, even though I think machine learning will actually take up some of the workload for him, so that he can play more golf for. That's certainly like one part of the problem. I think the other pieces, which I think go right the way back to what SOX was trying to make us do, right the way back in those early days, that it actually was trying to make like risk an integrated part of how reporting was done externally, and that mandate seemed to get very dilute. But that's what it was trying to do. It was saying, as you produce your financial statements, you should have like a clear-eyed view of what those risks are. And so we have some management commentary these days, but when you look at the distance between what's in the management commentary and the rigor and discipline in producing the risks and the evaluation of those risks, there's a big gap there between the public and the private data, and I think that will be condensed. That distance will be removed over the next few years. That's on the reporting side. And then I think the flip side of that is risk integrated planning. That if you are a very ambitious company, that you can produce very rosy pictures of what the future might look like for your company, but hang on, there's a risk aspect of that you're not giving the investors at the same time that you're painting that. You're actually painting that picture. So to make sure that we've got like risk-aware planning systems, and to give investors some surety that the risk-integrated model was also active at the time that we cast these forecasts, I think will be part of where we go in the future.
Okay, that's some amazing insight, backed with your track record of, as Brian said, sort of seeing way ahead and being right about it. So hopefully panelists will benefit from it. Brian, from a customer's perspective, I mean, what are the opportunities they're seeing? You spend a lot of time with some great, brands in this marketplace, Fortune 500 companies and so forth, as well as mid to size companies. I mean, what are some of the challenges and opportunities where GRC can help?
Well, I think there's a few, and several of which have been hit on by Nigel and by Yanni. But there's the two that come to bear or come to mind the most or get asked for the most. One is that, as Yanni mentioned, is visibility across both the continuous controls monitoring incidents and along with the kind of more the enterprise, higher level enterprise or business process risk. More specifically, what they're looking for is, it is a segregation of duties issue that we might have in purchasing. Is that an indication of an issue, or is it related to an issue we might have in the broader, procure to pay process? Right now, those are really sit in two different silos because it's two different technologies. And so what they're looking for is that kind of blended information to see if there is any relationship between an SOD violation in a particular area and then with a control failure within that same kind of business process, if you will. So that's one area. So I think that is paramount. The other area that we get asked a lot about is, back with the Oracle forms, I mentioned the PCG, or Preventive Controls Governor application, is you could actually build into your business processes that preventive capability. And so, where this comes to bear a lot, oftentimes with our clients, is those that are affected by revenue rec, rev rec, is right. They want to be able to, a lot of our clients want to be able to enforce data integrity as a transaction is being entered into to Oracle. And so, but they don't want now to have to, heavily customize with the cloud applications. That becomes even, more difficult. But looking for technology out there that will allow them to do exactly what Preventive Controls Governor allowed them to do, and where they could really build in some of those preventive controls at the front end of the business process as data is being entered into the ERP. And then, Nigel hit on the other one. Really, the third piece, if I would be just, the marrying up of risk associated with the kind of their budgeting, planning, forecasting type of activity to identify any issues or give a more realistic picture of where they might be, 12 months, 24, 36 months down the road, marrying up, risk with numbers.
Okay, well, that's fantastic insight, both from a technology and customer demand perspective. Certainly some notes I'm taking here to help guide us at SafePaaS. To just wrap up, I think we've got a few minutes left. Emma, there's one question that I'd like to get in before we finish this up. If you can, now that we have talked about this great future and talked about the history, if you're stuck in the past, you need a value. These days, everything needs a business case, right? Business justification to move off the old and start on the new. So Emma, this is one of the questions that you had laid out for us, and I'd love to hear from the panelists. Maybe Yanni and Brian, you can lead us on what are your customers looking for in terms of business justification to get off some of the legacy software that is either not supported by the suppliers or is just not cutting it. In other words, it's creating more risk than it's solving. You and I had lunch here in Dallas a few months ago, Yanni. So you had a pretty good points that you made to me, and I'd love to hear from you, and of course Brian and Nigel.
Yeah, thanks for that, Adil. And I think it really starts with as things changed and as we've kind of forced to see how changed in the last couple of months. Organizations comes to the realization, I haven't looked at all the risk. I haven't even identified the risk, and I don't even know what I don't know. I need to figure out where are the challenges, what are the challenges, and a spreadsheet just doesn't do it anymore. It's almost to the concept of, to touch base on what Nigel used on AI is, Google can probably predict better where the next flu outbreak would be than the CDC. So if I still use old technology to try and manage and identify risks, it tends to be very internal focused. It tends to be very siloed focused, and organizations just cannot afford that anymore. They need to start looking at what are the things that happens if I looked at it in the context of a business process. I need to look at risk in the context of the business process. And as my business process change with where my workforce work, where my technology is based, I don't have a data center. The transactions are processed at home at the dining room table of my workforce. So obviously the risk changed. Obviously, I can't stick with the old systems on how I manage that. I need to look at that with a new dimension. I need to look at that with new tools to be able to address those. And then on top of that, as I've mentioned earlier, it is now in the context of across my organizational walls or my organizational borders. How do I work together? To use COVID as an example, it's how do I achieve herd immunity to my risk? How do I really mitigate my risk, not as me as an organization alone, but in the ecosystem that I operate in?
Right. Excellent points. So Brian, I know you and I are talking to some of our common GRC customers, and what are they telling you? I mean, what is the business justification they're looking for to get off the old GRC products that we have talked about in this session?
Yeah, and I can answer this from the lens of a publicly traded company, but the same question I'm going to ask applies to private companies as well. And that question is this: if you're using legacy GRC applications or any other legacy GRC application for that matter, and that product, and you're relying on the controls associated with that GRC application, and the application fails, what do you do? What do the internal auditors do? What do the external auditors do? Because you've now been relying on that software to provide you the controls and controls monitoring, and that software no longer works, and the support for it is no longer there. What do you do? How do you communicate that to your external auditors? So that's the question I pose to my clients. But again, the same is true for private. That's a huge risk to be leveraging software that's outdated and no longer supported.
Okay, well, that gives us some assurances on looking at the future and making a case for why to move forward in these times. So with that, Emma, why don't you close us out? I think we're nearly out of time.
Yep. So to sum up, I think we can all appreciate that the GRC space has come a long way since the early 2000s, but there is still, there's still a lot more to do in the space. What was essentially a segregation of duties tool, to what we have now, which is, something that can be applied to the whole enterprise. So I just like to say a huge thank you to our panelists today. We've been delighted that you've been able to join us today. I've certainly learned an awful lot about, how GRC has evolved over the years, and I hope our audience has learned some valuable, gained some valuable insight as well. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the first part of a series that we are running for GRC customers. So our next session, which will be run by Adele and Brian, will focus on how you really can keep Oracle GRC even when there are no product updates from development, and that session will be live on October the 7th. So we hope many of you will join us. So without further ado, a huge thank you to our panelists and for you all for joining us today. So any last words from the panel?
Just a great thanks, and I look forward to seeing you on the next session.
Thank you.
Thanks
everybody.
Thanks everybody.
Have a fantastic day. Bye.
Bye.